We'll start with the Kavana. We gathered together against the brokenness of the world, seeking comfort and inspiration in Torah, the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. May our study in community deliver the wholeness and the peace, the shalom and the shlema that we seek. Let's do the bracha together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so the opening question for today, Martin Luther King famously said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Do you believe this? And what is the great injustice of our day that you hope to see expunged? Yes, Ashley.
Well, I don't know that there's any arc of any kind that we either move towards or away from. I'm all in favor of justice. I just don't know that there's a natural inclination, though who am I to know? And I would say the first thing that comes to mind is the awful inequality of wealth that we have. If we could do something to narrow the gap, that would be an achievement that I would be eager to embrace.
Well, Ashley, thank you for zeroing in on wealth. I think it's in so many ways the heart of the matter. Interestingly, in the work we've been doing at United Way to kind of refocus our work, we chose poverty as the marker for inequity. And that led to 12 communities out of 153 to focus on. And of course, solving poverty at the tip of the iceberg, there's like so much to unpack that, but I think you've hit the heart of the matter. Thank you for mentioning that. Anyone else? Yes, Annette.
I used to think Martin Luther King was right, but I don't anymore. Given what's happened in recent times. And related to what Ashley said, and I don't think this is just an issue in our time. I think racism, because I think racism is a big creator of poverty.
Yes, I think you're right to zero in on that. And certainly Boston, Massachusetts area is, I don't know if they've done similar studies. There's the famous wealth study that was done in Boston about net worth of households, and it's like white households 248,000 median net worth, and black households I think was -8. I think they're looking to refresh that study. Thank you for it's. I guess it's not an uplifting topic. Maybe does someone feel that the arc is bending upward? You can take whatever position you want on that. I don't want to push too hard. Yes, Nancy.
I agree with Ashley and Annette. I don't think the arc is bending towards justice, but partially also because I guess I don't really believe in fate. So I think it just is what it is. And I guess what I would hope for is just more tolerance of all kinds, just tolerating individuals. And countries but
Well,
I don't know if we're going to get there.
I agree that that's something to be wished for, and let's hope we get there. In the chat, and then Susanna, I see your hand raised. I would second racism, says Amanda. If we're thinking worldwide, I'd also add sexism. Eradicating that would make such a huge difference to girls and women worldwide. I would also say that I do believe it bends towards justice, but it doesn't just happen. People have to work for it. All right, Amanda, thank you for those sentiments. One for each mother-in-law. Thank you. I agree with both. Susanna.
Yeah, hi everyone. Shabbat shalom. It's an interesting question for me because I have worked for more than 4 decades in the field of international justice, and in recent years, most of us have been feeling very depressed looking at the autocracies on the rise, and at the same time, when we think about this, I regularly, now that I'm kind of on the older side of the curve, think about how long that it is long. And I have seen in my work an evolution from a time when there was absolutely no mechanism for international justice, criminal justice in the face of mass atrocities, to at least the establishment of many institutions that have held perpetrators of enormously massive atrocities to account. And that has taken decades in each individual case that I've seen. And I will just say that, it's a long arc and it bends, but it doesn't bend evenly. And so I think that the idea of progress, for example, in the notions of the rule of law, take twists and turns and require a long view and persistence. And I'll just add that what I've seen, which is truly impressive, is the way that people continue to go out into the streets, risking their lives to protest for justice, as we've seen, for example, and especially in the area of women's rights, as we've seen in Iran, for example, this year and last year. And it's truly moving. And that's where I see the hope.
Susanna, thank you for that view from, I guess, really on the ground and many years working in the struggle for human rights. So that is really valuable perspective. Thank you. Let me start with a summary of the Parsha. So Emor begins with various laws regarding what priests may do so that they can remain holy, limitations on contact with a corpse, who they may marry, how they may cut their hair and beards, who may serve as a priest. This must be a person without blemish. While in an unholy state, they have to refrain from engaging in holy matters, including eating of the sacrifices. Animals offered for sacrifice similarly have to be unblemished. Amidst the brutality of sacrifice, a law requiring that a young animal be kept with its mother for at least 7 days before being sacrificed, and forbidding the sacrifice of an animal from the herd on the same day as its young. Then a listing of all the major holidays in chronological order, starting with Shabbat and then moving through the calendar starting in Nisan with Pesach. As the saying goes, if it's not an Emor, it's not a major holiday. We start with Pesach, count 7 weeks to Shavuot. We're in the middle of that. And then in the 7th month, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, then Sukkot. A description of the commandment to light the menorah with pure olive oil and to bake and display 2 loaves of the showbread. The Parsha ends with the difficult story of the blasphemer and the famous passage translated an eye for an eye, known by the Latin name lex talionis, the law of retaliation. Truly a Parsha full of things to discuss. Let's take us to liturgical time. And actually, we're in the midst of a lot of interesting stuff. First of all, Nancy, maybe 3 weeks ago, you were mentioning Pesach Sheni, the second Pesach, right? Well, we are in the midst of Pesach Sheni was yesterday. So Pesach Sheni, second Pesach, comes 30 days after the first Pesach. And Pesach Sheni, there's a biblical passage where some people who were not able to celebrate the Passover came to Moshe and said, look, some of us were ritually impure and not able to partake of the sacrifice. Is there something you can do? And they actually allowed a sort of makeup holiday for those people who were not able to be there. And over time, it has been ruled to apply not only to people, well, ritually impure doesn't matter anymore, but people who were traveling and not able to be at a Seder, or even people, believe it or not, who intentionally skipped the Seder and said, not for me this year, but had a change of heart. And the Hasidim have invested this day with the spirit of second chances. We're more than halfway through the Omer count, 49 days from our deliverance from Egypt to the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. This is a time of personal searching. There's 2 nodes in the Jewish calendar, both around the equinoxes, which are inflection and reflection points. The more observed one, of course, Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. In the spring, we similarly have a time of personal renewal and inward search to make ourselves worthy of the gift of Torah. The Omer, traditionally, it's a somber time during which weddings are not performed, hair is not cut, almost like a mourning ritual. We're on day 30 of the Omer, and the sort of convention is that each of the 7 weeks of the Omer is associated with an attribute. And then within each day of the week, there's a second attribute that, so you have this little square with rows and columns, and each day has 2 attributes. This week is the week of Hod, splendor. And interestingly, it's about the amazing uniqueness and diversity of our world. Within this week, today's the day of Gevurah, discernment. So it's the ability to celebrate each tree, but also the forest, of being able to discern the pattern, how the world really works. Day 30 has a sense of wholeness. For example, the 30 days of mourning. And in 3 days, it's the 33rd day of the Omer. And it's the one day in the Omer where celebration is actually permitted. It's called Lag BaOmer. Lag is the Hebrew numerology for 33, Lamed 30, Gimel 3. And so during this brief respite, it's traditional to have outdoor activity. And the local weather forecast for the day is a high of 61 with a moderate breeze. So, definitely get out there on Wednesday. And then in the fun fact realm, Emor is an anagram for Omer. All right, that's totally meaningless. No drash there. Normally we jump in at the beginning, and actually, fairly typically, I don't talk about what we're going to do. But this week, I thought it would be useful to just put out there what we were going to talk about. And I don't know if people had a chance to read the 13 sentences. Is it safe to assume that everybody had a chance to just at least look at those 13 and have the basics of the story? Okay, Nancy, your body language is indicating maybe not, which is fine. So the gist of it is somebody comes in, to the camp and curses the name of God and ends up being stoned to death. That's the gist. So we're going to go into it. We're going to go to Vayikra, Leviticus 24, verse 10. It's the story of the blasphemer. Does anybody have it in front of them to read?
I have it in front of me. There came out.
So just the first 3 sentences, Ashley, if you could, 10 through 12.
Are you implying that I tend to go on? Is that?
I'm implying that you're very enthusiastic and you would go on. So, which is
Yes, first three sentences only.
Yes, please.
There came out among the Israelites one whose mother was Israelite and whose father was Egyptian. And a fight broke out in the camp between that half Israelite and a certain Israelite. The son of the Israelite woman pronounced the name in blasphemy, and he was brought to Moses. Now his mother's name was Shelomith, daughter of Dibri of the tribe of Dan. And he was placed in custody until the decision of the Lord should be made clear to them.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a very curious kind of newspaper account, right, of what happened. And I guess I'd like to look at it and ask the question, what do we know? And then we'll follow up with the question, what don't we know that we would like to know? So let's start with, what do we know?
Well, we know that a fight broke out.
Okay, there was a fight.
And we know between whom the fight was.
Who was the fight between?
A half Israelite and an Israelite.
Okay. Good. What else?
That the half Israelite pronounced, I guess, the name of the Lord in blasphemy.
Right, pronounced the name in blasphemy. Okay,
So I guess we assume that's what the fight was about, or did he pronounce, I guess we don't know. Did he pronounce the name of the Lord in blasphemy while he was fighting?
well, let's stick with what we know, and then we're gonna get to the what we don't know. There's a lot we don't know. Well, what else do we know?
So he got brought to Moses
Okay,
and placed in custody.
what's, right. So, and he got placed in custody because,
This is s- the son of the Israelite woman.
right,
But they both are sons of Israelite women.
right, but
There's
they're
a
different.
father who's not Israelite.
Yeah, the difference is one of the men is of mixed parentage, and the other, I guess, is implied doesn't have that. We know it's a son of an Israelite woman. I guess the lack of mention of the father leads you to assume that the father was Israelite. But I just want to go back to Annette. He was placed in custody. Why?
Well, I don't think we know. Was he placed in custody because he was fighting? Was he placed in custody because he was blasphemous? I
Right.
assume because he was blasphemous, but it's unclear. I
Those-
also have a question. Why are we told his name and not the other guy's name? And is that important?
Well, actually, so that's helpful. We know the name actually of the mother. We don't know the name of the guy. The mother is identified,
Yeah,
Shalomit, and we also know the tribe, right? The tribe is identified. So we know the mother's name, we know the tribe, and to put a finer point on the question that I had been asking, it's not clear what to do with him. Right? I mean, so Annette, you're right, he did something wrong, and so he's in custody, but they're also a little bit unclear about what to do with him, and so they are awaiting the decision of Adonai. Okay. I think, does anyone else have anything else we want to comment on in terms of what we know? Okay, let's go to the heart of what we don't know. Like, what are key things that you'd like to know?
The context of the blasphemy. What did he do? Did he just, I mean, part of this portion says that just saying or implies just saying the name of the Lord is blasphemy. I think it even says anyone who blasphemes his God shall bear his guilt. If he also pronounces the name Lord, he shall be put to death. Well, that's a very confusing sentence. So we don't really understand the context.
Right.
How did he do it? What did he exactly do?
What's the offense? Right?
Right.
We don't know
Right.
that.
Right.
What's the what?
Well,
is,
we know the offense is broadly speaking blasphemy, but we don't know specifically what he is alleged to have done.
we don't know what blasphemy means, right? What does it mean to say the name in blasphemy exactly? I mean, you could say those words, but this man ends up being put to death, right? So we're going to want to know a little bit more about what exactly the offense is. It's a little fuzzy. So I think you're exactly right to focus on that. What else do we not know?
we don't know what the fight was about. I don't know if that's important.
That's exactly right. We don't know what the fight's about. And I think it is important. I mean, you certainly would want to know because there may be some connection, right, between the fight and the blasphemy. Okay, what was the fight about? Okay. I think to me, those are the kind of the key questions here, right? What was the fight about? There is also the question of why are we talking about, identifying parentage, but we don't get any names? That's a little odd in this passage, right? Points you to maybe there's some significance there. Okay, so
Is this the first time where it says that one should not say the name of God?
So I do think that the Ten Commandments talk about not taking the name of God in vain.
Right.
But it's what your question about antecedents, I think, is interesting, because if you could go to Vayikra chapter 20, verse 9, and that
If anyone insults his father or his mother, he shall be put to death. He insulted his father and his mother, his blood guilt is upon him.
okay, so I think it's curious that a few chapters before, if someone curses or curses, Yikalel, it's curse, which I think is the same word that's used here in verse 24, your father or your mother, you're put to death. And so insulting God, one would think, is a more serious offense, and it kind of raises the question of why they didn't know what to do, right? It's a little curious to be befuddled as to what to do with this person, because you could deduce it pretty quickly. All right, so I'm going to call this like a Rorschach blot of narrative, right? I mean, you could bring what you want to bring to this narrative. It's really open. And there's this confusion about what to do with the blasphemer. And so the Midrash comes in to fill a blank, as it often does. And Rashi tells us, riffing on some words, let's just go back to 24, verse 10. There is this reference to going out and this Ish Mitzri, Egyptian, Ben Ish Mitzri, the son of an Egyptian man. But there's this reference to going out and an Egyptian man, and Rashi kind of goes, kind of reminds me of something. Anybody have a trigger when they hear those words to an earlier story?
Exodus.
Which story?
Oh,
So Rashi takes us to, let's do Exodus 2.
I've got it.
Okay, go ahead, read us 2:11, Annette.
Sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen.
All right, so the word Vayetze is in there, he went out, and Ish Mitzri, the Egyptian man. And Rashi comes in to tell us that the Egyptian man, who was the blasphemer's father, is the same Egyptian that Moshe killed. That's kind of out of the blue. And while we say it's out of the blue, there is actually one more textual clue. If you take a look at verse 13 in Exodus 2, remember, Moshe strikes this Egyptian man, kills him, buries him in the sand, and then the second day Moshe comes out and he sees two Hebrews, Nitzim, arguing. If you go to 24:10, back to our blasphemer story, the word for the dispute in the camp is Vayinatsu. So the Natzim root is the same. So with these three textual clues, Rashi says there's definitely a connection. And not only that, but Rashi goes further to cite a Midrash that says that Shlomit, the mother, was in fact sexually assaulted and raped by the Egyptian taskmaster who was beating the Hebrew. The Hebrew he was beating was Shlomit's husband. You really have to diagram this. And the blasphemer is the son of that rape.
one more time. Who raped Shlomit?
Okay, Shlomit. So the Egyptian taskmaster who was beating the Hebrew, Moshe killed him.
Right.
The Egyptian taskmaster actually raped Shlomit. And the man he was beating was Shlomit's husband.
Wait.
And there's this whole long story that Rashi brings about how the Egyptian taskmaster desired Shlomit, and the husband called the taskmaster out on it, and in retaliation, the taskmaster beats him. And then finally, to go to the The other issue is that Ashley, as you pointed out, what's the blasphemy? The tradition here is that Moshe killed the Egyptian taskmaster by using the name of God to kill him. And that was the blasphemy with the name. Okay, so it sort of ties all of these things together, relating Moshe to the blasphemer, to the Egyptian he killed. I need to tell you one other thing, which is going back to Annette. I think you asked the question, what was the argument about? Okay, so when you go to verse 24:10, it starts with this word vayetze, and he went out. And it sort of begs the question, where did he go out from? And the Midrash, also cited by Rashi, is that he went out of a court of law because he was looking for a decision. What was the issue? The issue was he, being the son of an Israelite woman, is an Israelite, right? Because that's where you get your nationality. But in figuring out where you were entitled to camp, that went by the father. So the tribal affiliation comes from the father. But with an Egyptian father, he has no tribal affiliation. And so he tried to camp in Dan with the tribe of Dan because his mother was from Dan. And a man from the tribe of Dan said, "You're not welcome here." He went to the court to say, "Please resolve my dilemma." They ruled against him, saying you can't camp with Dan because it goes by the father. And he walked out and he blasphemed. And the blasphemy was to try to kill his antagonist from the tribe of Dan, who said you can't camp here with the name of God. So now, with all of these facts filled in, why is there indecision about what to do with this person?
So what you just told us, that's all Rashi's imagination, right?
Rashi citing the imagination of earlier commentators, and Rashi is a kind of a compiler in most cases. Okay. Yes. So there's a lot of filling in. I was saying the Rorschach blot. The rabbis have a choice. The rabbis could have gotten on the blame train and basically said, "Oh, this guy was a blasphemer. He's an awful person," and da da da. But instead, they come in with this whole backstory. And so the question is, knowing the Midrash that we talked about, knowing this issue of if you curse your parents, you should, it's a capital offense. When you kind of weave it all together, why are the people undecided, and why are they awaiting the interpretation of God as to what to do? Yes, Ashley.
Well, it may not be at all that they are undecided, any more than if somebody steals a horse in the Old West, some of the people in town say, "Let's have a trial." Other people are saying, "Let's string him up." There is a process to be followed to make sure that justice is done. The words here don't say that they are unclear about what to do. They say they are waiting for the decision of the Lord. So there is in the process a decision that must be made. And until that decision is made, it's not clear what is to be done. That's the way I would interpret this. So the Lord or his agent or their agent have to decide, yes, this reaches the level of blasphemy, or it doesn't, or this is something shy of blasphemy, not requiring stoning, just poke his eyes out. I don't know what the hell they did, but there has to be a decision. That's the key.
So you're focusing on process, right? That we can't go ahead and just kind of, move forward to judgment. There needs to be some process to figure out,
You have to wait for a decision.
Okay, Susanna, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking that this is an interesting story, including the Midrash and Rashi's interpretation and the other commentators, because we don't have a lot filled in from the text. But to me, it's an interesting presentation or discussion around how justice evolves and how a justice system evolves, because this is in a very early phase of the Israelites as well as their neighbors, understanding what the rule of law means. And there's lack of clarity about what constitutes the law and what constitutes a violation of the law, and who knows it and who understands it, and what the punishment should be, and even how to assess what actually has happened. And all of those things are necessary for a proper and fair and equitable and transparent system of justice. So, I mean, I'm putting a modern spin looking backwards on all of this text, but I think in particular, the issue of what happens to an outsider who isn't part of the understanding of the norms or even the laws.
I think those are all fair points. Ashley's process point, and then the various layers of being able to administer proper justice. Anything else that people want to?
I'm just thinking about the fact that this nameless blasphemer, is he an insider or an outsider? You know, because, and if he's an outsider, is he being judged within a community that he doesn't really belong to?
So I think that's a wonderful point, Nancy. I'm not sure that one could argue he's an insider. There's sort of the tension of but he feels more like an outsider. The one thing that I would focus us on, it's subtle, but in verse 10, it says, Vayetze ben Isha Yisraelit, there went out the son of an Israelite woman, Behu ben Ish Mitzri, and the preposition that's used is betoch, within. And it is almost like outside coming in, and it emphasizes his outsider status in that very subtle preposition. And I think his outsiderness, to me, it really stands out, particularly with the labels of parentage. So go ahead.
I also feel like it's a certain intolerance. I mean, the woman was raped, right? And she was actually married to the Jewish guy, right?
Yes, her husband was the man who was being beaten. Yes.
Right. So, you know, just going backwards, it seemed like there would have been a little bit more tolerance to the child of the rape.
Well, that's exactly the point. I think you're exactly right. And I think part of the reason for the detention is, don't we have mitigating facts that someone would say, this man was born out of a traumatic event. This man is caught between these arcane rules where his mother determines the fact that he's part of the people of Israel and he left in the Exodus, but tribal affiliations through the father, so you're screwed. Maybe there's a pause to say, you know, this is kind of a harsh result for a sympathetic case. I think that's part of the detention. Ashley, you don't look like you're buying.
I think it's the other way around. I think the product of I think we're applying contemporary standards to a time when our standards were the reverse. The product of a rape was blemished by the fact that they were from a violent, horrendous act. They were not elevated as a victim and who should be understood, but rather soiled from birth as a product of an immoral act.
So, Ashley, you're pointing to a really interesting thing that I think is at the heart of wrestling with this passage, and why in particular I was drawn to study it together, because it causes this tension between, to what extent do we read the Torah and for a passage like this just say time bound, that was then, that was their mores, or are there lessons and tensions that can speak to us in the present day? And as we talked about at the beginning, the different tensions in what constitutes justice and achieving justice, and the fact that various of the people who talked about this at the beginning talked about, you know, it's not, the arc is not really bending towards justice, and maybe we haven't advanced from those early days. I think all of these questions are raised by this passage. Susanna, I see your hand up. Is that a vestigial hand or a new hand? Vestigial, maybe.
Definitely vestigial.
Okay, very good. So I want to go to one more thing that's a little curious, and it's verses 13 through 16 in chapter 24. And Joanne, do you have chapter 24 in front of you, 13 through 16?
I do. I have a different translation, but okay.
Yes, please.
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take out him who vilified beyond the camp, and all who heard shall lay their hands on his head, and all the community shall stone him.
Is there a particular fact that stands out in verse 14 that makes you take notice and go, what's that about?
Putting the hands on his head.
Yeah, I think that's curious. And what does that symbolize? Putting the hands on the head.
It's like a blessing almost, no?
It's interesting, right? It sort of partakes of blessing. We're going to talk about it a little bit more, but does anybody have any other immediate reaction as to what that could mean? Yes, Annette.
Well, there's something about it that makes it really personal. I mean, you're going to stone this guy, but you put your hand on his head. To me is, oh my God, I'm going to put my hand on the head of someone I'm going to stone to death. That's terrible. The juxtaposition of that is heart-wrenching.
Yeah, it's true. It's very dissonant and heart-wrenching. But how do you reconcile? Well, we'll come back to that, because I think it's an interesting question. And I think personally that this notion that they aren't really sure what to do with this person, and this putting the hands on the head are I come back to, why does the Midrash come in and fill in with sympathetic facts? Why doesn't the Midrash come in and make you feel better, if this is or interpret in harmony with the man's sentence? Why interpret with sympathetic facts that are counter? Because even after this, as Joanne just read, the Lord comes in and says, I know you've been waiting for my interpretation, stone him. And anyone else who does this, stone them. What's the Midrash doing? It's just totally, I don't know.
I think you have to understand the severity of the punishment and not dehumanize yourself from it. They're putting their hand on his head. Yes, yeah. Stone him, but remember he's a human being.
I think that's right. It's being in touch with the consequences of the death sentence and the fact that there's a human being behind it. I think that's exactly right. Thank you. Susanna.
Yeah, no, I just following exactly on what Annette was saying. I mean, I think it's really interesting and important when we think about the history of when these commentaries came about, that as far as I understand it, the death penalty has never been recorded to have been exacted under Jewish law all those centuries. And so the severity of and the finality of the death penalty was understood from the Talmud on to be so severe that every possible precaution would be exercised. And I think I really agree with Annette about recognizing the humanity, but also the extremity of this punishment. And even though we have in the Torah a lot of stonings in there, in fact, in all the subsequent centuries where we know the death penalty was never exacted.
Yeah, that's a great point, Susanna, and we'll talk about that a little bit subsequently. So that I think also resonates with Ashley's point, right, about the detention and following due process, because knowing the consequences. So all of that kind of harmonizes and does that well. Joanne.
Yeah, I'll also say that it makes one remember that the tactile aspect forms a memory in a person that we cannot forget. this person for what we have done. There's also a sense of the entire community becomes responsible. That's the next phrase, which we come to. You haven't mentioned that yet, that it's the entire community's responsibility. But I really feel that memory matters, and this touching, this actual physical contact, because in stoning, you have no physical contact. It's only the stone that hits the person.
Mm.
But in this case, you do.
Oh, those are great points. Thank you, Joanne. And all that work about trauma in the body, and there's a range of different things, and the communal responsibility. Thank you. Let's go a little bit further in the passage. So we've read through verse 16, and then there's this twist in verses 17 through 22. Joanne, you read Annette, I don't know, you read a single sentence on. Why don't we go to you, read 17 through 22, if you could.
Okay. If anyone kills any human being, he shall be put to death. One who kills a beast shall make restitution for it, life for life. If anyone maims his fellow as he has done, so shall it be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury he inflicted on another shall be inflicted on him. One who kills a beast shall make restitution for it, but one who kills a human being shall be put to death. You shall have one standard for stranger and citizen alike, for I, the Lord, am your God. I have a question about this,
Yes.
because this seems internally inconsistent.
Yeah.
So if all these people stone this guy to death,
Right,
then shouldn't they be put to death?
right, exactly.
Well, you're going to certainly the heart of the capital punishment problem, right? And if human life is sacred, under what circumstances should you ever be taking a human life, even if it's in punishment for murder? And that goes to Susanna's point and Ashley's point about all the process and making sure that it's not easy to put people to death, and Joanne's point of understanding the consequences of it. So that's great, and that's a challenge. What's the passage doing in here? Does it seem like it follows the story of the blasphemer? It's all of a sudden glommed on this eye for an eye thing.
No, so I can't figure that out.
All right, go ahead, Ashley.
It seems deliberate. I mean, here you just, as Annette pointed out, you've ordered the community to kill a man. The sentence ends with that. And then the very next paragraph, kind of juxtaposed, not sequentially as far as the story, says, if anyone kills a man, they shall be put to death. I mean, that can't just be, coincidence. That's deliberate. So that weird, you're going to kill this guy, the whole community is going to kill, and if you kill, you'll be put to death, must be there to make us at least think, what are we doing?
Yes, that's fair point. There is definitely the thematic connection that this is what's happening to the blasphemer, and now it's generalized. It's a little bit weird storytelling to jam it in there, but certainly one can argue fairly that at least belongs somewhere. If you have this eye for an eye passage and the editor is thinking, where shall I put it? All right, we can put it here. So before we go on, so Vayikra is a challenging book, right? And I think the absence of narrative makes it particularly challenging. And when I say absence of narrative, it's sort of like actually not total absence of narrative. There are two narratives in Vayikra. One is this, and then the other is the death of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, by the strange fire, right? So the two narratives that you do get are actually rather harsh. And I do think that and we've talked about this before, about the issue of how to handle the harsh passages of the Torah. And I think that they go back to, Ashley, some of what we were talking about earlier that you pointed out. Is like, is this about the mores of that time? And is this basically something that you turn the page and say, okay, this doesn't really have lessons for us? Or is there some ways in which the harshness that we are experiencing in these stories in the Torah actually speak to us today? And I guess I would say that if we have, maybe it was a majority of people questioning about the arc of justice, the question is how far have we really come? Then maybe some of these ancient cruelties are not far away from us. But there is an interesting saying that says, one Midrash that says, there's no portion in the Torah that cannot be brought back to life if only we had the strength to interpret. So it's throwing down the gauntlet to say, keep digging. And so the question is the only lesson of this story how not to behave, or that was a cruel time and we're beyond that? So I want to mention one analogy. When I first started in law school, someone said to me, law is to justice as medicine is to immortality. And meaning the aim of the law, rather lofty, but elusive and unattainable. I think the Torah has a pithier expression of this, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. The repetition of the word justice is about the difficulty of attaining justice. So the blasphemer, in my reading, it has this backstory that breaks your heart. The people pause, unable to execute this man, provokes their sympathy. By the way, also, Moshe couldn't judge this man because he kind of had a conflict, as we modern lawyers would say, because of his involvement in the blasphemer's backstory. So the people throw it back to God because the brutality and harshness of it is just too much. I have a friend who's a trial court judge, and I was asking him, what's the thing that makes justice hardest for you to dispense? And without pause, he cited the mandatory sentencing guidelines and just basically said, I sometimes feel like my hands are tied and I have to dispense these sentences that don't match the facts. And in some ways, the stoning of the blasphemer is a mandatory sentencing guideline. And you can see the pause. I want to go to the eye for an eye passage because this shift to this, it's called the law of retribution, retaliation, lex talionis. Joanne, going back to the eye for an eye, you start with 18.
And he who is mortally strikes down a beast shall pay for it, life for life. And should a man maim his fellow, as he has done, so shall it be done to him. A fracture for a fracture, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Okay,
As he,
we can stop there. So it's the same translation there. That's interesting.
but a note on it, which is a little to the side.
Give us to the note. What's the note?
The note, it talks about pay for it. And he, since the word pay is used, he says life for life herely cleans the monetary value of the dead creature. And so he talks about monetary value for each of these. That's where Alter is taking it.
Right. So the traditional Hebrew understanding is that it's monetary. And there's the use of the word at the end of verse 20. If you look at the Hebrew, it says, Kain yinatain bo, so it shall be given to them. And the rabbi sees on the word given to say, that's kind of more consistent with money. Also, the preposition, it's not eye for eye, it's ayin tachat ayin, an eye under an eye, which is weird, right? So what does that mean? Well, it's not exactly eye for eye. It's something maybe less than the eye, and it's not complete compensation, right? And so the rabbis have taken that to mean that it's monetary compensation. And some of them get into real detail, like what if a one-eyed man blinds a two-eyed man in one eye? And so now he loses his eye? No, it can't be. If you have to come up with a universal thing. There's and then also the fundamental problem with these ancient laws, which were in Babylonia and all over the place, these retaliatory laws, is they don't achieve justice. Right? I mean, if you've lost your eye, how are you compensated by putting out the other person's eye? Right? That's just revenge, right? But what about your loss? And so the money, while it doesn't give you your eye back, as a law professor of mine used to say, it's the next best thing. But at least it's restorative, right, justice in some sense, as opposed to simply kind of revenge. And the whole issue of how to dispense justice in these situations is complicated. And I think this is in part a thematic tie-in to the law of the blasphemer, right? Because the blasphemer, there's this issue of how are we going to do justice for the blasphemer? These issues of, well, how do we do justice for someone who's had their eye put out? How do we deal with someone who's killed somebody, understanding the moral quandary of murder is wrong, and the fact that it's being done as punishment to a murderer doesn't necessarily make it right. To Susanna's point, the Talmud is replete with requirements before the death penalty could be administered. At one point, we covered something that talked about 23 judges needed to hear a capital case. And then there was that whole rule of unanimity. If there was unanimity for a guilty plea, guilty finding, the accused went off free, because the feeling was that if you can't find one clever person amongst these 23 to find the extenuating circumstances, maybe the defendant is being railroaded. There's a famous passage that says a Sanhedrin that executes a transgressor once in 7 years is characterized as a destructive tribunal. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says that's once in 70 years. And Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva say, if we had been members of the Sanhedrin, we never would have executed anybody. And so there's this race to compassion. And I just, Joanne, I see you, but one last thing. Shimon ben Gamliel, who was a noted hard ass in various different ways, says, if I had adopted that approach, or if you had adopted that approach, or we would have increased the number of murderers among the Jewish people. And so taking the other side of, there needs to be some deterrence. And so you can see the old debate about how to handle capital punishment playing out thousands of years ago in the Talmud. Joanne.
Yeah, I also believe that there is a Talmud rabbi, I can't remember who says that any decision which is unanimous is automatically wrong, because it would mean that the whole group has pressured everybody, because it's impossible for that many people all to feel the same way. So therefore, a unanimous decision must be that somebody was pressured out of his opinion.
Right. That was that unanimity rule. Yes, yes. And so all these safeguards against groupthink and maybe also going against the person who's on the outside. I want to talk about the laying on of, yes, Susanna.
I just wanted to also note that, as far as I understand it, Adolf Eichmann is the only person ever executed by the state of Israel.
Oh, that's an amazing fact. Thank you. That puts it in sharp relief when you think about what he represents and who he is, and that's the only one. I want to just take a side note on the laying on of hands. And I do think that for me, it is a question of to what extent society needs to look at systemic forces that result in the desperation that fuels crime. Where does social responsibility end and individual responsibility begin? When cocaine's treated lightly in terms of sentencing, and crack, which is more used in the minority communities at that time, given multiples of that sentence, disproportionate impact on communities of color, what kind of justice is there? And there are many kind of examples of that. Looking back at this story, what could the society have done for the blasphemer who was caught between these two rules? What exception might have been made, with regard to sort of planting the flag with them? In another bit of synchronicity, this whole issue of dual identity and being in, being out, and this man of dual identity with no place for belonging has actual deep resonance with Pesach Sheni. And Rabbi Avi Killip from Hadar noted in a recent drash that Pesach Sheni in recent years in Israel has become a day for queer pride and inclusion. In her words, a day on which we notice queer Jews remembering the ways they have been left out of ritual Jewish life and celebrating the opportunity to include them now. Some might say the arc of justice continues to bend, at least in that set of rights. So the story of the blasphemer, so humanized by the Midrash, coupled with the law of retribution, to me, point to timeless dilemmas in the search for justice and equity. The balancing of justice and mercy has always been hard and can lead to agonizing outcomes in cases where the defendant provokes our sympathy despite outrageous crimes. The justice that is simply about retribution is hollow, despite our thirst for revenge. That just compensation can be hard to measure, restorative justice hard to attain. The Torah presents these challenges without offering the answers, but instead offering stories that underscore the difficult questions, which seem embedded in our existence. Existential problems humankind has always faced, giving rise to stories older than Genesis. And in their harshness and impenetrability, these difficult stories offer us a gift. They scream at us, don't look here for an answer. These stories are from a different time, a different conception of God. You need to look around and see what it means for you today. This constant search for meaning to make sense of our own time, that is what makes Torah and Eitz Chaim in both senses of the term, both a tree of life that gives meaning to our lives and a living tree that grows and adapts with us to be an ever-renewing source of inspiration. And so we continue the search for a path to justice, posing unanswered and perhaps unanswerable questions. May we attain justice in our day, and until we do, may we have the strength to keep searching. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi Richard.
I took the correspondence course.
Yesher koach.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and have a wonderful Shabbat and weekend.
Thanks, Rich. Shabbat Shalom.